Happy New Year, everybody. Justin Clark here with Bill Stepien for the Yes Labels podcast. In 2024 election year, presidential election year, we are 1 week away from the Iowa caucuses. There's been a dearth of Iowa polls after the new year. I suspect we'll see a lot more this week, and we'll go over them. But we do have a bunch of new polling in this week, and we want to talk about it. You ready to jump right in, Bill?
Let's do it.
All right, cool. We'll start with the primaries this time around and then head to general election poll, which I think we'll have a lot more to say about. But we will start in the state of New Hampshire, first in the nation primary. It is, I suppose, 2 weeks from tomorrow, so January 23rd. And it looks like things might be closing a little bit. Keep in mind for all the listeners out there that New Hampshire is an open primary, and there is no real Democratic primary this year. So you will have a lot of Democrats and independents voting in the Republican primary. And so polling may be a little off, maybe a little skewed, and may not accurately represent kind of where the Republican primary electorate is at the moment. But I will jump right in. We have an American Research Group poll that was done over the new year, ended on January 3rd. And there's been a lot of criticisms of American Research Group in terms of their polling. I'm not going to jump on the bandwagon, but what we do have for them is a benchmark from December. So they've got two polls so we can see movement. I'll start with the January 2024 numbers. You have Donald Trump at 37%, Nikki Haley at 33%, and Chris Christie at 10%. Everybody else is in single digits, below 9% undecided. Compare that to December. You have Trump is +4 from the December poll. Nikki Haley is also +4 from the December poll. And Chris Christie is -3 from the December poll. Bill, what's your big takeaway in the American Research Group poll in New Hampshire?
And unsurprisingly, undecideds from December till now are starting to move, right? From 12% in December to 9% in January. So they're starting to make up their minds. Two things were pretty interesting to me. One, partisanship and vote intensity. Trump is +12. He's winning 42-31 among Republicans. He leads Nikki Haley 42-31, a 12-point advantage. Among unaffiliated voters, you mentioned open primary, non-Republicans can vote in the primary. Nikki Haley is leading Trump by 7, 36 for Nikki Haley, 29 for Donald Trump, 14 for Chris Christie. What's interesting to me is when you overlay that with voting intensity. Is a person definitely going to vote? Is a person probably going to vote? Among those definitely voting, Trump is leading by 3, 36-33 over Haley. Among those probably voting, he's leading by 15, 47-32. So what's interesting to me, I just threw out a bunch of numbers. Usually the candidate who's leading among the independents, as Nikki Haley is also leading among the probably voters, the probably voting voters, because that assumes independents, unaffiliated voters are less likely to vote given the strength of their partisanship. And conversely, if you're leading among Republicans like Donald Trump is, you're usually stronger among those who are definitely voting. However, like in this case, it doesn't really equate, right? Trump has a 12-point lead among Republicans, which isn't surprising. And while he's leading among those definitely voting, it's only a slight lead by 3. He has a 15-point lead among those who are probably voting. So that's unusual for Trump, right? Usually his support comes from those who couldn't possibly be deterred from voting. Those voters who would vote, standing in 3 feet of snow for 3 hours to wait in line. Interestingly, in New Hampshire here, his numbers demonstrate, if you believe the poll, that Trump's success could be based on convincing those less likely to vote to get out to the polls. And that's really rare. That's usually for Trump. That's usually something that exists for other candidates, not Trump. That's my main takeaway.
Well,
Justin.
And to touch on what you just said, what's interesting there is it kind of puts Nikki Haley in a little bit of a catch-22, right? She is spending a ton of money in New Hampshire right now and in Iowa. Some of the weeks leading up to this, she's been the biggest spender, her and her super PACs together, pro Haley stuff in both places. What does money do in a race? It raises voter awareness of that race is one of the byproducts of television advertising. And so she's going to make that probably number more likely to vote and actually get some of the people who are lower than probably, which I assume would also probably even more so benefit Trump now, to show up and vote, which is really interesting to me because it does create a problem for her. The bigger the turnout, the worse off she is at the moment, and according to this poll.
Mm-hmm.
My big takeaway on this one is the Chris Christie number. He's the only one of the three main candidates in New Hampshire who lost support from December to January. Regardless of what we think that, regardless of how we think that, or where we think that vote came from, although it probably came a little bit from undecided, or probably went mostly to Haley, I would assume. The according to, and this is Chris Christie's own words, the whole rationale for his candidacy was to, quote, stop Donald Trump, close quote. He actually might be handing this election to Donald Trump if these numbers are right. And I'm with you, Bill. I think that the probably voter, the Trump voter, that 15-point lead there means his number is probably going to be a little higher. It's going to over-index to this poll. But
right.
Chris Christie, you are helping Donald Trump win this New Hampshire primary. And I don't know if you agree with this, Bill, but if Trump wins Iowa and then wins New Hampshire, I'm not sure anybody's stopping him. I'm not sure anyone's stopping him anyway, but certainly in that instance. But Chris Christie, if your number one goal is to stop Donald Trump, you should get out of the race and endorse Nikki Haley. But he won't, because I don't think that's his primary motivation. But anyway, I can't read his mind.
I've got one other takeaway, and it involves a candidate whose name you didn't mention.
Okay.
And that's Ron DeSantis at 5% in this poll. 5% in this poll. Ron DeSantis just had the single worst year in American politics that I can remember. And it's not just because he's receded into irrelevance at this point. It's where he started and how he got here. Think about how he started 2023. Fresh off his reelection, overwhelming reelection, flying high after storming to reelection. Voters loved how he took on COVID. They loved his culture fights against Disney and banning diversity funding for in-state colleges. Donors were flocking to his campaign. And UNH poll, University of New Hampshire poll, January of 2023, DeSantis was winning. I went back and looked, 42% DeSantis, 30% Trump, 8% Haley. And where is he now? He was asked this weekend if he would consider being Nikki Haley's vice president. It's and he hasn't had the single worst year in American politics because he's going to lose. A lot of people lose president when they run for president. There's only one winner after all. It's not because he's not a part of the day-to-day debate any longer. It's because his national political career is damaged, over for the foreseeable future. Done, finished. Look, you can lose and preserve future optionality, right? I think Nikki Haley has put herself in a better spot for future runs. In 2016, you had a slew of people who left the race in better position, if not equal position, to when they started. Cruz, Hall, I'd say Ben Carson, right? They all looked as good or better after losing. They introduced himself to new voters, new support, made good impressions. But the way DeSantis entered this race and where he stands now, he will leave this race, whenever that is, with his political reputation in tatters. I'd say irreparable harm to his brand. And it's really hard to do as much damage to yourself as he's done to himself over a 1 year period.
I couldn't agree more. I think that is a underreported. People are already writing the obituaries of his campaign in the New York Times and other places. I mean, The underreported thing is the long-term damage. It's pretty incredible to me.
Our first podcast was back in June, and we're never going to be the I told you so guys, but we said back
I think
then he
you're
was going to
about
have a
to.
hard time because we knew, peeking under the hood like we did, he was running a bad campaign. He
Yeah.
wasn't saying anything that mattered. He ceded way too much of his campaign to an outside group that cared more about self-promotion than candidate promotion. And maybe most of all, he's not that good of a candidate.
I still
On the
don't know.
stump.
I still don't know what
Yeah.
his reason for running is. He hasn't
Right.
told anybody why he should be president or why he wants to be. I mean, terrible job. Terrible.
South Carolina follows New Hampshire, as we know. There was a Emerson poll out of the field on January 5. It showed Donald Trump leading the pack at 54%, Nikki Haley in second at 25%, the aforementioned Ron DeSantis at 7%, and Chris Christie at 5%. Justin, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to talk about the top line real quick, but then I want to dig into another question they asked, which I found interesting. So obviously, Nikki Haley way underperforming in her home state. That 25%. Well, A, it shows Donald Trump's popularity in South Carolina. B, it shows her weakness in her home state on the ballot. We saw this when we were polling in South Carolina primaries earlier in the year. She and Tim Scott were both struggling to really convert, their long-term name, ID, and association with the state into votes. I will say this about South Carolina: the presidential primary process is cumulative, and it's based a lot on momentum. And South Carolina is, I believe, it's not the following weeks, a couple weeks after New Hampshire. If she gets close in New Hampshire and becomes the story and can start putting money on TV in South Carolina in a meaningful way, I would expect these numbers to change. That's a really tough spot to start from in South Carolina. I want to dig in. So they polled both the Democrat and the Republican primaries in South Carolina, and they did a survey where they asked some general election questions. What are your biggest issues, that type of thing. They also asked an abortion question, which I found interesting. That's what I want to get into. Do you support or oppose? Here's the question: do you support or oppose South Carolina's current abortion law that bans abortion after 6 weeks? So this is Democrats and Republicans, and they found support 37.5%, oppose 44.4%, unsure 18.1%. I find this fascinating, Bill, and this reinforces a point that we've made on this podcast before, which is the conventional wisdom on abortion politics has been turned on its head since Dobbs, and no one is quite reading the tea leaves in the right way, meaning support for abortion rights has become a bipartisan at some level. And I'm not getting into the policy debate about where to draw lines and when life begins and all that kind of stuff, because that's above my pay grade. But in terms of a political issue, the fact that South Carolina, a state that will almost 60% vote for Donald Trump in the general election this fall, only 37.5% of voters support a 6-week abortion ban, is really telling. And reinforcing what I just said, which is some sort of support for some sort of abortion rights or absolute pro-life policy position is a bipartisan issue right now. And trying to read into how abortion votes impact ballot votes is really hard. And I think it's a fool's errand at this point, because that is like widespread support, especially in a state like South Carolina. They don't have crosstabs on here, but that's a lot of Republicans who are going to vote in the presidential primary who oppose a 6-week abortion ban.
Good points. And you've talked a lot over the last months about abortion politics. Smart to note it here. I'll look at kind of the reverting back to the norm, different than we just talked about in New Hampshire. Trump is winning big among Republicans and winning big among those very likely to vote, which is what we would expect. Different than New Hampshire, right? Haley, and he's among Republicans, he's up 29, 62 to 31. He's up 57 to 24 among those very likely to vote. So if you're a Republican and you're coming to the polls, you're with Trump. Conversely, the softer voters, the independents, the less likely to vote, Haley's overperforming. She's winning independents by 4, 37-33. And Trump just has a 3-point lead among somewhat likely voters, 34 to 31. So South Carolina is performing, acting, behaving a lot more like what we would expect. If you're a Republican, you're going to be at the polls. You won't be stopped from voting. You're with Trump. A little bit different than New Hampshire, at least based on what the polling information was.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I think there's one other poll we want to go through this week. And CBS News came out with their survey yesterday. It's a national poll done January 3rd through the 5th by YouGov. And big poll, 2100 and they asked a bunch of questions. So rather than run through the top lines, I'm gonna start with what I just general approval stuff, and then we'll just start talking back and forth. So they asked the question: do you approve or disapprove the way Joe Biden is handling his job as president? Approve 41, disapprove 59. Then you get to the strongly and somewhat approve and disapprove. Strongly approve within that 41% is 15%. Strongly disapprove is 43%. I'm less worried about the strongly disapprove number because that 43% is probably going to match whatever the Republican generic ballot is right now. But that strongly approve 15%, that is really low. That is a shockingly low number for that's your base. That number should, at this point in a cycle, be closer to that 41%. They've already spent a lot of money and they've already campaigned a bunch. They have a real problem there if only 15% of voters strongly approve the way Joe Biden is doing his job. And by the way, you break down on it. I think the tail's wagging the dog here a little bit, but you break down on specific issue sets in the economy, it's a 36 over 64 approve. Immigration, 30 over 70. Inflation, 33 over 67. The situation with Russia and Ukraine, 41 over 59. Like I said, I think his overall disapproval is probably infecting those numbers a little bit. But man, that number is really bad. 15% strongly approve.
So what was interesting to me about this poll, Justin, it was how this poll compared to the same CBS poll from January of 2020, right?
Mm-hmm.
Joe Biden is entering his reelection year. The calendar's turned. It's on, right? January of 2024. CBS did the same poll 4 years ago when Trump was in office. And while a lot changed from January 2020 to May 2020 with COVID and all that ensued, looking at the same poll 4 years apart, it really shows the challenge that Joe Biden has, as you're outlining, and it shows the type of campaign he's got to run. You mentioned Biden's approval was minus 18, right? 41% approve, 59 disapprove. 4 years ago, Trump was at 43% approve versus 51% disapprove. Trump's approval was 10 points better, net 10 points better. Big difference among the candidates' bases. Biden has 80% approval among Democrats. Trump had 89%, to your point. Biden's 80-20, Trump is 89-10. And even among independents, Biden's at 33% approval among independents. Trump was at 40 back in January of 2020. So a lot said about Trump and supposed issues and weakness that he has among independent voters, but Biden's doing a net 25 points worse than Donald Trump was at this point in his presidency.
It's pretty telling. And look, you mentioned all the stuff that happened between January 2020 and November 2020. A lot of stuff can happen, but I will say this: it is I don't know the thing that happens that make numbers go from that low to that high. I could see something happening that could make numbers tank and be problematic and change things in a negative way. But to fix the systemic image problems that Biden has and has continued to have since really the Afghanistan withdrawal in August of 2021, to fix that seems like a monumental task. Like I said, they've already spent close to $35 million on TV around the country. They are aggressively targeting groups. They get all the earned media they want. They don't exactly have a principle that can carry a message these days, but still they can get on TV whenever they want and they can drive whatever
Mhm.
message they want. We've seen that. To still be at this number, it's going to take something extraordinary, you know, to be able to move this. And I don't know what that is. I don't even know what it could be. But whatever conventional campaign thing they're doing isn't going to cut it. I just don't know how you get numbers from that bad to better at this point in a presidential cycle.
Some of these comparisons between now and 4 years ago, pretty astounding. Let me give you a couple. Voters were asked about the state of the economy. 35% of voters now say the economy is good. 35%. Back in 2020, January of 2020, 75% of voters said the economy was good. The highest in 20 years that the CBS poll had seen. Voters were asked this January about the president's handling of the economy. You mentioned, I think, 36% of voters gave Joe Biden high marks. 57% of voters 4 years ago gave Donald Trump a good rating. It's a 48-point net swing between Trump in 20 and Biden in 24. And just one more. Do you think things are going well or badly in this country? The CBS poll just released, 34% said well, 66% said badly, minus 32 net. And importantly, just 4% of independents say things are going very well. Just 4% of independents. That's lower than Republicans. 6% of Republicans said it's going very well. And back 4 years ago, it was minus 12. Now it's minus. So a 20-point net swing from 20 to 24. And to your point about what you do if you're Joe Biden, he's got to make this election about Donald Trump. We saw this past week he tried to make, January 6th a national holiday. His surrogates were all over the airwaves. He was in, I think Valley Forge, giving a speech on the topic. Smart, right? I mean, try to make it a month-long event. Incumbents
but
usually want to make. Go ahead.
I was going to say, but I've really questioned a lot of their tactics and strategy over the last year. And look, I get it. I don't think they have much else to campaign on other than January 6th. The problem is it's been in everybody's face for like 3 years. I don't know what person who has a disapprove on Joe Biden doesn't have a well-formed opinion on January 6th and Donald Trump and his role in it already. As a political issue, I just don't know how you're going to move that. And then they've spent the last year, and again, not talking about the merits of this, but they've spent the last year indicting and investigating Donald Trump out of one side of their mouth and then talking about a threat to democracy out of the other. It's just, I don't know the efficacy of pounding the January 6th table for them right now. And I don't see it moving these numbers. It just doesn't make a ton of sense for me. People want to know what you're going to do. If let me put it this way, Bill, if Barack Obama was running for re-election right now and you had a crisis at the border like this, you know what he would have done? He would have given a big speech about how we need to secure the border. He would have sent the National Guard down there, done some big dramatic act, and then offered conservative Republicans who controlled the House at the time, they control the House now, the sun and the moon and the stars on an immigration deal. He would have forced it down the left's throat, the Republicans would have gladly taken it, counted it as a win, but it would have actually been a loss because Obama would have campaigned on it for the next year. And then probably after he got reelected, changed all the policies back to whatever liberal stuff he wanted anyway. But you get my point. Forward looking, progress. We're doing things. We're taking action. You get nothing out of these guys. Absolutely nothing. Bill, take I'm ranting, so I apologize, but take the Colorado and Maine kicking Trump off the ballot, okay? That's like super un-American. Like nobody thinks that that's a good idea, sets a horrible precedent. It's terrible, objectively terrible. If Barack Obama or George W. Bush were running for re-election, someone did that to one of their opponents, they would have given a speech or at least a statement and said something like, I want to beat this guy at the ballot box. This is un-American and nobody should be doing this. Like forward-looking, progress, like pushing an agenda, pushing what you're going to do. These guys don't do anything. It's insane to me. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I like your Obama comparison. I think it's smart. The big difference, as we know and you've touched on, Obama led his party. He controlled the policy. He controlled the politics. Everyone else fell in line. Joe Biden, this was talked about during the 2020 campaign, predicted in the 2020 campaign, Biden's held hostage by those on the extreme left in his party.
Yeah.
To me, that's the huge difference. And in terms of how you run the campaign, if you're Joe Biden, incumbents usually want to make their reelection a choice between two candidates, as opposed to a thumbs up or thumbs down referendum on the incumbent's 4 years in office, while the challenger wants to do the opposite, right? Biden needs to do something entirely different. He needs to make the election a referendum on Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And not Trump's policies, which look better by the day, not anything tangible, but a referendum on things like democracy and January 6th and preserving American institutions, whatever that means. He needs to sell voters on that being more important than grocery prices and interest rates and what people are seeing pouring over the border. That's not an easy sell, to your point.
Yeah, good luck with that. I mean, I just don't see, and you touched on something there, Bill. I agree with you 100%, but you touched on something there. The referendum thing. Well, we've never had two incumbents running against each other, I don't think, before.
True.
Not in a real way. You got two incumbents right now. And so it's a referendum on both of them in a way. And right now, Joe Biden's losing that referendum. And I don't see them fixing it with what they're currently doing. And I don't know the thing that changes that allows them to fix it. But as you and I both know, we're in an environment right now where we do exceedingly close national elections, and I don't anticipate this one being much different.
Close again.
Yep.
For sure.
Bill, you got anything else on the CBS poll or any other thing you want to bring up?
I don't. I think that about covers it for the week.
Cool. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. We will be back soon with more polls, more data, more talking about politics and giving you our insider scoop on what we think's happening. If you like our podcast, like it, subscribe, follow, send it to your friends, do whatever you got to do. We appreciate you all. And again, Happy New Year.